Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. My name is Martijn Verdonk from the Netherlands Enterprise Agency, which is part of the Ministry on Economic Affairs and Climate Policy in the Netherlands. As a co-author of the 8th National Communication and 5th Biennial Report, I will present to you the progress by the Netherlands in meeting their climate targets. First, I will share our experiences with the international assessment and review process. The Netherlands has submitted its 8th National Communication and 5th Biennial Report at the beginning of December 2022. In good collaboration with the UN Secretariat, the in-country review was organized in March 2023 in The Hague. During the review, many fruitful interactions took place between national experts and the review team. This was much appreciated from both sides as this increased the understanding of national policies in a wider context. The review team rigorously reviewed our NC and BR, and amongst others, they concluded that the reported information mostly adheres to the guidelines. Acknowledgements were made of improvements by, for instance, including emission intensity factors and by providing detailed information on resources provided to non-Annex 1 countries with regard to their needs on mitigation and adaptation. Also, they identified issues related to include clarification when certain information was not provided. Also to include additional information on the impact of policies and measures, and to include information on the differences with the previous projection. For the multilateral assessment, we want to express our gratitude to those who have raised some good questions: New Zealand, Canada, Japan, United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. Most questions were related to our policies, such as carbon capture and usage, public transport, district heating, and green jobs. Also, questions with regard to our approach to monitor greenhouse gas emissions and to track the progress of policies. We've responded to the questions through the portal, and we will touch upon some of them also in this presentation. In order to better understand the context of our climate policies, I presented you some key facts on the Netherlands. And as you can see, the Kingdom of the Netherlands is a kingdom containing 4 countries. The NC and BR reports are on the European part of the kingdom only. By far, the Netherlands has the largest contribution of greenhouse gas emissions within the kingdom, and also the Caribbean parts of the kingdom are not signatories to the Convention or the Paris Agreement. In this slide, I will go into more details on where we are coming from in terms of emission trends. Shown are the emission trends between 1990 and 2021, according to the latest National Inventory Report from 2023. The left figure shows the emission trends by gas. In 2021, total greenhouse gas emissions amounted to 172 megatons of CO2 equivalents, which includes indirect CO2 emissions and emissions from land use change, and forestry. This is almost 25% below 1990 level, while the economy has increased by more than 80% in the same period. Up until 2010, most emission reductions were achieved in the reduction of non-CO2 emissions like methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. After 2010, we can see that CO2 emissions are starting to decline as well. In 2021, this was 15% below levels of in 1990. The right figure shows the emission trends by sector. As you can see, the energy sector is by far the largest contributor of emissions in the Netherlands. The emissions decreased by 14% in this period. Drivers for this were mainly improvements in energy efficiency by end users, switching to more efficient fuels, and increasing production of renewable energy. The share of emissions from agriculture is rather stable, around 11% of the national total, and is the largest contributor of methane and nitrous oxide emissions. The share of emissions from industrial processes and product use decreased from nearly 90% in 1990 to less than 5% in 2021 as a share of the national total. And this was mostly due to reduction in industrial processes, like for instance the nitric acid production. Emissions from LULUCF and waste are relatively small in the Netherlands. The quantified economy-wide emission reduction target was based on the joint European Union climate target for 2020, which was a 20% reduction in 2020 compared to 1990. This 20% target was split into a part covered by the European emission trading system and a part which was to be reduced by the member states. This effort was shared among European member states, and for the Netherlands this was set at 16% in 2020 compared to 2005 levels, which was one of the highest targets within the EU. The targets were then translated in a cumulative emission allowance for the entire period 2013 up until 2020, amounting to 921 megatons for the Netherlands. The EU as a whole overachieved this 2020 target with a reduction of 34% compared to 1990. In 2020, the EU 27's emissions covered by the effort sharing decision were 16% lower than in 2005. And in the Netherlands, the non-ETS emissions were 29% lower than 2005, which was much lower than the 16% target. And also on a cumulative basis, the emissions in the Netherlands in the entire period were 123 megatons below the available allowances. And also ETS emissions declined in the Netherlands with 8% between 2005 and 2020. Meeting the targets for 2020 was just the first step in meeting the ultimate objectives of the Climate Convention and the Paris Agreement. Therefore, we also reported on meeting climate targets up to 2030. In 2019, the Netherlands adopted a National Climate Act, including provisions on emission reduction targets, the adoption of a climate plan, and regular evaluations. The current national targets are a 55% reduction by 2030, net zero emissions by 2050, and negative emissions thereafter. Targets are applicable to the national emissions as reported in the inventory report, so this includes emissions from land use change, and forestry, but not international aviation and shipping. In order to meet the climate targets, the Netherlands has a broad mix of sectoral and cross-sectoral policy measures, of which some were in place since the 1990s. The basis for the current policies is the National Climate Agreement, which was drafted and signed in 2019 by more than 100 stakeholders from all economic sectors and also civil society. Some key policy measures in the Netherlands aim to increase the deployment of renewable energy, especially for solar PV and offshore wind. The Netherlands currently has the highest solar capacity per capita in Europe, mostly driven by subsidies for solar on rooftops and solar farms, and net metering for house owners. Offshore wind capacity is increasing rapidly, now up to 2.5 gigawatts, which is a doubling compared to 2019. An additional 2 gigawatt is being built and 1.5 has been permitted. The aim is to have 21 gigawatts by 2030. Production of green hydrogen using renewable energy is also stimulated in order to replace grey hydrogen used in industry. The building of several large-scale electrolyzers is being prepared, which should result in a capacity of 8 gigawatts by 2032. Also important is the phase out of coal in the power sector and ultimately all fossil fuels in the energy mix. Several inefficient coal-fired power plants already have been closed to meet the 2020 targets, and the remaining of the plants will stop using coal by 2030. And after 60 years, the exploitation of the Groningen gas field has ended in 2023, even though the field was not depleted. And this decision was driven mainly by the damage in the region resulting from many earthquakes. Therefore, strong incentives are in place to reduce natural gas consumption by end users, like for dwellings and industry. A mix of policy measures improves the energy performance of dwellings and also the phase out of natural gas consumption by, for instance, the introduction of CO2 norms, which de facto forbids the installation of new gas boilers as of 2026. For industry, a national CO2 levy is in place since 2021, and companies are required to implement energy savings in combination with reporting obligations. For the mobility sector, we have a long-standing and successful fiscal regime based on energy efficiency and CO2 performance standards for vehicles, which resulted in one of the highest adoption rates of EVs within the EU. For a future net zero energy economy, a more long-term and integrated planning is required. Therefore, a national plan on the energy system will be published by the end of this year. It will contain an integrated vision on the energy system by 2050 and the needed steps forward, such as building the needed infrastructure. And this plan will then be the basis for many future policies. Now, where do these policies take us? As required by the Climate Act, the impact of policies are annually assessed in the National Climate and Energy Outlook. The outlook takes into account the impact also of relevant factors like economic development, fossil fuel prices, and technology costs. It also identifies key uncertainties, which is translated into a bandwidth of likely results. The projections in the NC and BR were based on the outlook from 2022, which included policies up to spring 2022. Recently, the Outlook 23 was published, and that included policies and measures up to spring 2023. This is presented in the blue column. The good news is that the target of 55% reduction is within the bandwidth of this estimation, but the side note is that this is only the case when policies fully materialize their impact and external developments are favorable. In order to address these uncertainties, the government develops policies that should add up to a 60% reduction. In order to cope with uncertainties, strong monitoring and evaluation instruments are included in a policy cycle. The implementation of policies are monitored by various agencies. Data is collected to show the progress in a dashboard on climate policies. The Climate and Energy Outlook assesses the expected impact of policies, and the government then informs the Parliament on the progress and expectations annually. After political debate, new policies or adjustments may be announced by the government, and then the cycle starts again. Also, 3 legal bodies give advice to the government. The Council of State, which is the highest general administrative court, advises the government on the climate plan and the climate policy brief. In 2022, a scientific advisory body on climate change was established with independent scientists who advise on a new climate plan foreseen by 2024. A citizen forum was instituted this year in which 175 randomly chosen citizens will advise the government on how to improve climate policies. And also, the Netherlands has a strong tradition in performing ex-post policy evaluations on a regular basis, which also feed into this policy cycle. Now, I would like to conclude this overview of the climate policies in the Netherlands. We are committed to meet ambitious climate targets, which is shown by our Climate Act. For this, all sectors and stakeholders are engaged to participate in the transition, as this cannot be done by government alone. Continuous learning through multiple monitoring and evaluation instruments help us to keep on track and adjust policies where needed. With this, I want to end my presentation. I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you and goodbye.